Welcome to the Male Vacancy Project podcast. I'm your host, Amadeus Hyman. I started this podcast because several years ago, when I hit rock bottom in my love life, I also hit rock bottom with myself. I experienced what I later in therapy learned to call an ego death. My instinct was to steer into the storm and go as deep as I could. And in the process, I lost part of myself, but I also found part of myself. The more I went into the self-development work, the more I realized that the part of myself that I lost was the immature, the boy version. And the part of myself that I found was the mature, the man. You see, for my entire adult life, I had a lot of imposter syndrome around this idea of being a man and being an adult. And this experience was like a switch got flicked. I no longer felt like a boy trapped in a man's body. I finally, very confidently, felt like a man. And so the worst thing that ever happened to me ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me. And as I was building myself back up, trying to figure out what type of man I wanted to be, I went looking for role models, as all young men do. But what I found was alarming. The majority of men I found claiming to be role models, especially in the online space, were exhibiting a very immature or shadow form of masculinity, which these terms I learned to use as I dove into the work of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. Many would use the phrase toxic masculinity to describe the type of men that I saw. Luckily, I was in my late 20s at this point. I had a solid group of friends around me to bounce ideas off of and enough awareness to not fall for their allure. Unfortunately, many young men are not so lucky. I realized that although we have an abundance of older men in our society, we have a severe lack of elder men. These are men who have faced their own demons and come out the other side stronger, wiser, more in control of themselves, and more equipped to handle the stresses of the world. Men who are able and willing to be a guide for younger men and boys as they try to navigate their own ascension from their immature boyhood into their mature manhood. This vacancy, this void left by elder men is being filled by these immature, hyper-masculine internet gurus. And so, as I've heard many people say, we have a crisis of masculinity on our hands. As young men and boys are learning how to be a man from immature men who are preying on the desperation of young men searching for role models in today's confusing world. So the reason I started this podcast is to be a counter to that, to provide an alternative to the young men looking for guidance. On this podcast, I'll dive into the literature and the research. I'll break down topics in the broader conversation of masculinity through lots of different lenses. And I'll bring on guests who display these more mature and healthy forms of masculinity, things like respect, resilience, adaptability, emotional intelligence, and regulation, and more, so that young men and boys can have examples of healthy, mature, masculine male role models when they go searching for them. I'll also bring on guests who have different viewpoints. I'll bring on guests from different backgrounds, different races, different cultures, different ethnicities, different religions. I'll bring on guests who are women and who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, because I think those members of those communities often get overlooked in the conversation of masculinity. And I don't really understand why, because they have a lot of good things to say about masculinity. So I'm going to bring on a lot of different guests to talk about this topic through lots of different lenses. I think this is an incredibly important conversation to have. And if you agree or if you're curious about it, please subscribe to my podcast. Share this with a friend. Join my email list so that you can get newsletters and updates about the show and about other projects that I'll be doing in this endeavor. I'll put the link to join my email list in the show notes. And that's all I got for you tonight. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, Amadeus signing off.